continue with the rest of the project, you have to go to my GitHub and download these assets. So I will link to this in the description and in the blog. Just click code, download the zip. Then you want to open up wherever your project is. So mine is here. And then you want to extract that zip file here. So it should have a folder called assets, and it should be fonts and these images. So you'll need this to continue the rest of the project. Now that we have all of our assets in our folder, we can start creating the components and then creating the entities and attaching those components to the entities. So we can create components using normal Rust structs. We'll create a component for the player. And this doesn't contain any data, it's just something we have so that we can check if an entity is the player entity by checking if it has the component player, right? Create another struct, and we'll call this one name, and it's a tuple struct, so it just has one value of type string. Create another one for the gold and the dynamite. Struct for dynamite, and then make another struct for our points, so the money. And this one will give it one field, and that'll just be called money, and it will be type of unsigned in 32-bit. That way they can't go negative money, right? So now we have all these components. We can start creating the entities and attaching these components to the entities. And we can create all the startup entities using one function. So we'll call this function setup, and that will set up all of our entities that we're going to be used right away and add them all to the screen. So player, gold, all of these things will just be created and added to the screen. Then we'll add logic to them later. So this function needs a few things. It needs immutable commands, and that's type commands. This commands function has it gives us a spawn so that we can spawn things to the world, add them to the app builder. Then we need asset server. Underscore server, that's what we'll call it, and it's type res, and it's asset server. So we need this to load the assets into the game, like with our pictures and sprites and stuff like that. Then we need to attach the sprites to the player by getting another type, which is, we'll call it material, and this one will be mutable too. Materials, and this is a resource mutable. So here is a resource. This one's called a res mute, and type assets, type color, material. That's all we need right now, and that's our whole function. That's all we need right now to these types is commands. Got this wrong. Commands, the asset server, the material, all these things will be passed to us by Bevy, right? We can add this to the world by doing a dot add startup system, and then setup dot system. And Bevy will take care of the conversion. It's going to take this function, turn it into a system, and add it to our world. So now we can start loading our assets using this asset server. So we'll load the player texture first. And that is of type, so it's going to be assigned the asset server dot load. And then by default, the asset server will look at the assets folder, which we've created. Inside of there, we want the image folder. So, and there it's called the player.png. That's what our player is called, right? And we're getting this error. Basically, it's saying it wants this explicit type. It can't get it implicitly, so we can just give it the type. Handle texture. Sometimes it gets the type, and sometimes it won't get the type for you, so you might have to explicitly type it yourself. Handle texture. And then we can copy this type basically, and then pose it 2 more times, because we need to load a few more textures, right? So we can load the gold, just called gold.png, and dynamite. Now we can change these variable names, right? Call this one gold texture, and then we'll call this one dynamite. Now we have all of our textures loaded to the world. We can spawn our camera. So there's no camera in the world, right? So we got to add a camera. And this camera will allow these textures to load. Without the camera, you can't see the textures. And that's where the commands come in. So you can type commands dot spawn bundle, and there is a camera bundle that we can spawn. And we want a 2D camera since our game is a 2D game. And we'll add the UI camera later, I guess. So now we can spawn our sprite bundles, our textures. Our textures are added to the world, but you won't be able to see them. There's nothing there. They have no transform. They have no position. They have nothing attached to them. They have no material attached to them, right? So there's picture, but you can't see them. We can do that by saying commands dot spawn bundle, and we want a sprite bundle. Sprite bundle is a struct. We can open it up. If you highlight over it, it tells you need all of these things, right? So again, we're just going to do the default right away. That way we don't have to take care of anything. And there's a few things we want. So we want to change this sprite. We want to add the player sprite to this sprite bundle, right? So let's type material. And we're going to use our materials. So these materials can get these textures, since these were added to the screen. They were added to the asset server, and the res mutable can grab all of them. So materials dot add, and we can add our player texture dot into, and that'll cast it to the correct type for us. Into the function. Then we also want to change the player's position. So we can call transform. And that is a transform. It takes a transform struct. So inside of this transform struct, you can see there's a few things: translation for position, rotation, so you can rotate it, and scale if you want to resize it, right? So again, we'll just do the default right away, so we can get rid of that error. You might not want to do this default. You might want to do it at the end so you know exactly what you need. I just like to do it right away because I know what I'm going to use. So I'm going to change the translation, and that takes a vector 3. Called a new function to create a new vector 3. And we can supply the x, y, z. We're not making a 3D game, so we don't need the z. And the x-axis will just give it 0. So that it's at the center of the screen, basically right here at the bottom of the screen. I have an image in my blog that you can look at, but you'll see it on the screen right now, I guess. And negative 280, so negative 300, and negative 300 would be the bottom of the screen, since our window is 600, center would be 200, center would be 0, highest point would be 300, lowest point would be negative 300. We'll do negative 280 so that we're a bit above the bottom. And these are floats, and that's why I'm getting that error, so put a dot there. And then we'll just scale our image a little bit because it's kind of too big. And this also takes a vector 3 of a new function. And again, we can scale on the x, y, and z. So scale 0.2 on x, 0.2 on the y, and 0 on the z. And we're getting error explicitly typed, so we'll just put F32. That should fix that. I put vec right here. It's just supposed to be vec3, right? And I added a dot at the end, so that fixes that. And that error was just because we forgot a comma right here to separate the transform type from the default, right? So you need a comma, like you have a comma here, you need a comma to separate between these fields. And now that we have this entity right here, there's no way to really tell that this is the player entity, right? Other than the fact that we added the texture to it. So this entity would have a transform, it has the scale, it has also has a material and a transform. These are the two components on this entity, right? We can add more components to it right here. So we can insert, I will insert the player component, and then that will allow us to keep chaining, and we can keep inserting more components. We'll also insert the name component, and we'll just call our player. Try to cast that to a string. So now our component, our entity, now you know 100% this is the player entity because it has the player component attached to it. Now when we look for this entity in the world, we just look for an entity that has the player component and it has the transform component. We can use the transform component to change its translation, move it around, change its scale, and then we know it's the player because the player will be the only entity that has the player component attached to it. We can also check the name as well. And we can keep adding more entities to the world. So we added this one entity that's the player. We can add another entity. And this entity will be, we add the gold and dynamite entities as well. You just copy this because they'll have similar things. Just paste it. And instead of using the player texture, we'll use the gold texture. Instead of it being player, this will be gold, and again we'll make this gold. We can just reuse the code, right? We don't have to touch the size because the image by itself is smaller than the player, and we're using 0.2%, 0.2, so we're multiplying 0.2, so it will be much smaller than the player, so we don't have to touch the scale. And the position of this, we'll put it a bit above the screen. We'll put it like a 300. And then we'll keep the z-axis the same for now. The x-axis the same for now. We'll change it later randomly so that it spawns randomly on the x and the y-axis. But we'll keep this for now. And then we can copy and paste the same thing again for the. Just reuse the code to do this for the dynamite. So we'll change this to dynamite texture and change the name to dynamite. Now we'll give it a dynamite struct component. And then we'll just change the size a little bit because dynamite by itself is really small, so we wanted it a tiny bit bigger just so you can see it. We'll keep the position again the same. We'll change the x-axis a little bit so you can actually see it. And then that should be it. Now we have all of our entities on the screen. We'll add the money entity later after we have a position, after we create a random position. So let's see the output. Wait for this to run. Okay, now here it is. So there's our player entity right here at the very bottom center of the screen. And at the top, you can see both the dynamite, which is right here, the red, and the gold. They're both right beside each other because their position is really close to each other. I have a picture on the block that shows how this positioning works. So basically 0 on the x-axis is right here at the very bottom, if you can see my mouse. And then 0 on the y-axis is right here at the center of the screen. And that's why we had it like negative 280, which is right here at the bottom. So you can actually position a player at the bottom. And 300 really would be at the very top since the height of our screen is 600. So 0 at the center, 300 at the top, 300, negative 300 at the bottom. And then it would be the same thing for the width. Our width is 800. So 0 would be here at the center, negative 400 would be on the left, and 400 will be on the right. We can close our game, and now we can create a function that will get a random number and randomly assign the random number to the translation, to the position of the gold and the dynamite, so they're positioned randomly every time they spawn. Well, this function only runs once, so we're just going to change the position on initial run and up, and then later we'll create another system to change the position on whenever we want, right? We'll look for a condition. If the condition is true, then we'll change the position.